Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving into a truly crucial shift in global power dynamics. Imagine Europe, a continent that for decades operated largely united under a strong transatlantic alliance, suddenly finding its fundamental footing challenged. We're talking about the profound changes in US-EU relations that unfolded during the Trump administration and how these shifts pushed European member states to pursue more independent, autonomous policies. Our mission in this deep dive is to really extract the most important insights from our source material, helping you understand this fascinating evolution and what it means for the future of international cooperation.
Yeah, and beyond just the headlines, what our source reveals is that the Trump era didn't just disrupt transatlantic ties, it actually served as a kind of brutal stress test for Europe's internal unity. It exposed some of its deepest fault lines and maybe accelerated this long-standing quest for true autonomy. We'll be meticulously examining how those traditional economic and political ties began to fray and what that meant for individual EU member states as they sought new, more autonomous paths. The critical question really emerges. How did a seemingly external policy shift in one powerful nation lead to such a significant internal realignment across an entire continent? I mean, challenging decades of established norms and alliances.
That's precisely the core of our exploration today. Our source material specifically examines how the Trump administration's actions, things like questioning the very function of NATO, imposing pretty unprecedented tariffs on European products, explicitly supporting the Brexit process, and fostering remarkably close relations with certain far-right European leaders, how all that served as credible evidence of this policy change. We'll also extend our gaze a bit, look at how the current U.S. administration, under President Joe Biden, continues to reflect certain aspects of this new, maybe more inward-looking approach. Even without that direct support for far-right leaders, it suggests maybe a deeper systemic shift in American foreign policy. We're looking at all of this through the lens of neoclassical realist theory, which is a powerful framework that helps us connect the dots between these big global shifts and the nuanced domestic responses they provoke. So what does this all mean for the future of international relations and for the alliances we once thought were, immutable? Hashtag the historical bedrock of US-EU relations. To truly grasp the significance of this shakeup, we need to go back to basics, to the very foundations of the transatlantic relationship. Think about Europe right after World War II. Utterly devastated, economies in ruins, and the continent starkly divided by the emerging Iron Curtain. You have the Soviet Union dominating the East, posing a significant ideological and military threat, while Western Europe faced these immense reconstruction challenges. The United States emerged from the war as an unparalleled major power militarily, politically, economically, culturally. And its involvement wasn't just about, celebrating victory. It was about strategically restructuring Europe, fostering cooperation to prevent future conflicts, and crucially, containing Soviet expansion. This period saw the establishment of what became known as the Atlantic Alliance, built on shared democratic values and a mutual defense against a common adversary.
Exactly. And this takes us back to some pivotal moments that really solidified this foundational relationship, embedding the U.S. deeply into Europe's recovery and security. The Truman Doctrine of 1947, for instance, that marked a significant turning point. It provided crucial military and economic assistance to countries like Turkey and Greece, explicitly aimed at preventing communist expansion into the Mediterranean. Many historians actually cite this as the symbolic start of the Cold War, signaling a new era of global ideological competition and direct U.S. engagement in European affairs. Then, the Marshall Plan, formally enacted in 1948, followed. It provided absolutely crucial financial aid, billions of dollars, to Western European nations like Britain, West Germany, Belgium, France. Its purpose was, well, it was dual-pronged and strategically brilliant, really. First, rebuild shattered economies and infrastructure. I mean, they were in ruins after years of conflict. And second, vitally, to remove trade barriers, thereby fostering stronger, intertwined economic ties with the United States. If you zoom out for a moment, these were the initial foundational steps in building that transatlantic economic and security alliance, the one that would define the latter half of the 20th century. They weren't just humanitarian gestures or aid packages. They were strategic investments in a new world order, actively shaping Europe's future. Hashtag NATO and European security, a shared umbrella.
Okay, now let's turn specifically to the security front. Because hand in hand with economic aid, robust military support quickly solidified U.S. influence and, Europe's security architecture. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, formed in 1949, became the vital defensive alliance, unequivocally led by the U.S. And this wasn't merely a symbolic pact, it was a concrete commitment. An attack on one member was considered an attack on all. That provided an unprecedented level of collective security for Western Europe. You had countries like Belgium, Canada, France, the UK, the U.S., and later Greece, Turkey, West Germany, all uniting against this perceived existential threat of Soviet invasion. NATO essentially formed one side of the Cold War's two major blocs, facing off directly against the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact. It created a clear line in the sand across Europe and, ensured peace through deterrence.
Right. And while NATO provided that overarching security umbrella, even early on, there were signs of European states trying to assert their own interests within this framework. A notable example is France's temporary withdrawal from NATO's Integrated Military Command in 1966 under Charles de Gaulle. That was driven by a desire for greater national autonomy, a more independent foreign policy stance, though they did remain politically aligned and eventually rejoined fully in 2009. The post-Cold War era, well, it brought new challenges and opportunities for Europe. It prompted the formation of the European Union as a political union in 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty. And importantly, that included establishing a common foreign and security policy, or CFSP. Yet despite these developments and Europe's ambitions for a more unified defense, NATO continued to be the undeniable main security umbrella for Western Europe. It just shows its enduring central importance. The relationship was further formalized, deepened even, by the Berlin Plus Agreement in 2002. That agreement allowed the EU to utilize NATO's infrastructure and planning capabilities for its own security agenda. It indicated a deep, intertwined operational relationship, not really a separation. It outlined several key pillars of cooperation, like exchanging classified info, assured access to NATO planning, availability of NATO assets for EU-led operations. And they conducted joint actions, in places like the Concordia operation in Macedonia in 2003, and later in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Afghanistan, often under the banner of combating international terrorism, which became a major concern for both the U.S. and NATO after 9/11. This really highlights how Europe's military security was for decades deeply nested within that transatlantic framework. The U.S. provided the lion's share of the defense budget, contributing, 73% of NATO's expenditure by 2014. It was a relationship of dependence, sure, but also one of shared purpose. Hashtag transatlantic trade, the economic glue.
Okay, so beyond security, trade was absolutely the economic glue. It solidified this transatlantic relationship, transforming it into a powerhouse of global commerce. Our source highlights the 2000s as a kind of golden period for transatlantic trade, a time when economic ties really flourished, fostering immense prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic. We saw concrete agreements like the EU-US Open Skies Agreement in 2007. That made it significantly easier for airlines to operate between the two continents, boosting travel, cargo flows, underpinning deeper economic integration, creating a sense of seamless connectivity. That same year, the Transatlantic Economic Council was created, specifically aiming to boost free trade and economic cooperation. It signaled a mutual desire to deepen commercial links, remove lingering barriers.
Precisely. These concerted efforts were expected to significantly contribute to the EU's economic growth, its overall welfare, fostering a sense of shared economic destiny. There were even ambitious proposals, for a transatlantic free trade area dating back to the 90s, and then negotiations for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, which began post-2013. That was specifically designed to ease market access by harmonizing regulations, eliminating tariffs. Just for perspective, in 2012 alone, the EU's imports from the U.S. stood at 356 billion euros for goods and services. Exports to the U.S. were even higher, 457 billion euros. It just shows the immense volume and the mutually beneficial nature of this trade. The broader implication here is that this economic prosperity, secured in large part by initial U.S. aid and then these robust, continually deepening trade relations, that was a major factor in the success of the EU's integration, its attractiveness to other countries seeking membership. It effectively created a kind of welfare zone that eliminated internal conflict areas, drew in new members, reinforcing that liberal international order. However, and this is a critical turning point mentioned in our source, these negotiations for TTIP were notably halted by the Trump administration after 2016. Trump's motivation was explicitly rooted in a perception that the EU was benefiting unfairly from trade with the U.S. It signaled a significant departure from previous administration's trade policies. It challenged the very premise of integrated transatlantic economic growth. This unilateral halt was, it was a harbinger of things to come.
So,
You've hit on a key point there. Neoclassical realism goes beyond simply looking at the international system as just this anarchic environment where states primarily react to external threats. What's crucial here is its emphasis that domestic factors and social influences also play a significant intervening role in shaping a country's foreign policy and how it pursues its national interests. This includes a variety of variables: a state's own power capabilities within the international system, how its leadership perceives threats and opportunities from other actors, the specific political approaches taken by its leaders, deeper domestic political dynamics, even the role of civil society actors within the country. It's a sophisticated bridge, if you will, between purely structural theories that focus solely on the international system and more constructivist approaches that highlight ideas and identities. A critical query emerges from this: how do powerful leaders deeply embedded in their domestic context and responding to internal pressures reshape a country's foreign policy? And by extension, the broader international landscape. How do they cause this ripple effect on long-standing alliances and partnerships? It acknowledges that the international system provides constraints and opportunities, yes, but a state's response is filtered through its complex internal political processes.
And that brings us to two key points from our source that are central to our analysis of the Trump era. First, it highlights the Trump administration's dramatic policy changes toward the EU. The source argues that a political leader, particularly one as impactful as Trump, can significantly shape a country's foreign policy, and, in doing so, attempt to reassert its dominant global role, even if it means disrupting existing alliances. Trump's actions were an attempt to project U.S. power in a new, more unilateral way, directly influencing the international structure. The second point focuses on the reactions of European states. Our material indicates that these countries began openly discussing and pursuing their own national interests, influenced by both these new international pressures, the shifting U.S. stance, and their unique domestic situations. The source specifically notes how leaders with close ideological or, personal ties to Trump were particularly influential in shaping these interest-based policies. This helps us see how a state's behavior isn't just about its place in the global system, or just about following some preset path. It's also fundamentally about its internal workings, the desires of its public, and the specific choices of its leadership, especially when powerful international figures encourage that kind of autonomy. It's a complex interplay, really, where both external pressures and internal characteristics determine a state's actions and its foreign policy trajectory. Okay, let's zoom in now on the Trump era, specifically the period post-2016, because our source describes a dramatic and, frankly, unmistakable shift in transatlantic relations. While earlier U.S. presidents, like Barack Obama, deeply admire the EU project for fostering peace and stability among historical enemies, Trump's presidency brought a fundamentally new dynamic to the fore. Our source points to Russia's military intervention in Ukraine in 2014 and the annexation of Crimea in the same year as events that initially sparked widespread fear and concern in NATO and EU states, particularly those in the Baltics, where some Lithuanians and Estonians even started training for guerrilla warfare out of genuine fear of Russian aggression. But then, during the Trump administration, there was this perceived unwillingness from the U.S. to act decisively against this Russian aggression in Eastern Europe. This led to a palpable sense of mistrust among EU member states regarding NATO's traditional, ironclad protection. What truly stands out for the source material is how investigations in the U.S. about Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and advisor Carter Page, how revealing their close ties to Moscow was seen by many European allies as a direct and deeply unsettling connection. This, our source argues, kind of cemented the perception of a fundamental divergence of interests, leading to profound mistrust in their supposed security guarantor.
Yeah, this perceived unwillingness to act and the broader shift, it clearly reflected a core tenet of Trump's America First pledge, which bluntly put nationalism and national interest front and center, often above multilateral cooperation. Our source suggests this differed dramatically from previous U.S. presidents who, while pursuing national interests, largely did so within the existing international rules and institutions. This distinct approach under Trump began to dissolve the traditional Western alliance, which for decades had been characterized by shared values and common security. It effectively paved a way for some EU member states to pursue more autonomous policies, no longer solely relying on the collective framework. Trump explicitly questioned NATO's function, frequently threatening to withdraw U.S. forces if European countries didn't contribute more financially. Despite the U.S. already contributing, 73% of NATO's expenditure in 2014? He even went so far as to call Europe as bad as China, viewing them primarily as economic competitors rather than essential strategic partners. He essentially argued that European countries were benefiting from U.S. protection without fair contribution, stating that breaking these ties was plausible due to the immense U.S. expenditure. Stepping back, this wasn't mere rhetoric. It felt like a strategic dismantlement of the post-WWII liberal order, forcing Europe to confront this uncomfortable truth. Its security umbrella was no longer unconditional. It radically redefined what ally even meant. From a neoclassical realist perspective, Trump's policy shift, moving from a hegemonic protector to a competitive partner. That represents a structural change in the international system, prompting other states to reassess their positions and strategies.
And these words, this rhetoric, quickly translated into concrete, impactful actions that directly affected European economies. The U.S. National Security Strategy, issued in December 2017, explicitly spoke of correcting trade deficits that had persisted for years. It signaled a clear intention to protect American workers and industries. As a direct result of this protectionist stance, the U.S. imposed tariffs on imported steel and aluminum products from EU member states, alongside Canada and Mexico, on June 1, 2018. Germany, being a major steel exporter, was particularly hard hit by these measures, as the EU collectively exported, 3.6 million tons of steel to the U.S.? The initial response from the EU was actually a show of community mentality. On June 1, 2018, the EU launched legal proceedings against the U.S. at the World Trade Organization, arguing the tariffs were illegal. Furthermore, under rebalancing measures, the EU imposed its own retaliatory tariffs on selected U.S. steel products as of June 22, 2018, and initiated a broader protection program for its own steel and aluminum producers. Then in October 2019, the trade skirmish escalated even further. The U.S. imposed new tariffs, amounting to $7.5 billion, on a wide range of European products, from cheese and wine to olives. This was in response to long-standing EU subsidies for Airbus. This really ignited a significant and damaging trade dispute, creating immense pressure on individual European economies.
So the critical question then becomes, given this systemic pressure and these direct economic threats from the U.S., how did individual European countries choose to react? Our source provides a compelling example that perfectly illustrates the neoclassical realist framework in action. The Italian president, Sergio Mattarella, specifically visited Donald Trump at the White House on October 16, 2019, explicitly in search of solving these escalating trade issues and, well, to avoid retaliatory tariffs for Italian products. This wasn't just Italy seeking a better trade deal, it's a textbook neoclassical realist moment. During a news conference with President Mattarella, Trump openly encouraged Italy to get rid of EU burden, explicitly stating, and I'm quoting here, quote, "Without the burdens, as unfair as they are, imposed by the European Union, we would actually have a much higher number than $70 billion between Italy and the United States. He thought we were a little bit harsh on Italy, and we don't want to be harsh on Italy. We'll never do that. So we'll look at that very strongly." This comment clearly shows Trump's strategy, interacting with individual nations, actively encouraging them to break from the collective EU stance. Mattarella's visit shows a state adapting its foreign policy directly to a perceived shift in the international power structure. That's Trump's protectionism, filtered through its domestic economic needs, avoiding those tariffs, and directly influenced by the specific approach of a powerful leader encouraging bilateralism. And crucially, it shows the direct influence of a powerful leader like Trump in encouraging such autonomous actions, validating a state's decision to act independently, even if it undermines the larger bloc. This wasn't an isolated incident either. It became something of a pattern. #, the refugee crisis and the path to Brexit.
Okay, another major, almost seismic factor contributing to Europe's push for autonomy and profoundly shaping its internal dynamics was the refugee crisis. Following the uprisings in the Middle East, particularly the brutal Syrian civil war starting in 2011, asylum applications in the EU soared dramatically, over 625,000 in 2014 alone, and a significant portion, about 20%, were originating from Syria. Initially, countries like Germany, Sweden, the UK, they showed a remarkably welcoming spirit, often citing humanitarian values as a moral imperative or even practical considerations like needing to fill labor gaps in their economies. This open-door policy was a testament to Europe's liberal values at the time.
However, this welcoming approach, it quickly dissipated due to various critical developments and, sadly, a series of tragic events that fueled public anxieties. Our source specifically mentions major terrorist attacks in Paris in November 2015 and in Belgium in March 2016, alongside highly publicized mass sexual assault events in Germany during New Year's celebrations in 24/5/2016. These events, tragically, fueled widespread fear, racism, and animosity towards refugees among significant segments of the European populace. Compounding this, the sheer lack of infrastructure and organizational capacity for such a massive, unprecedented influx of refugees. It further intensified hostility, overwhelmed national systems. It led to a humanitarian and logistical crisis, What does this tell us about the bigger picture? It led to several EU member states, including Germany, Austria, Slovenia, Hungary, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, making the significant decision to reintroduce internal border controls by September 2015. That effectively challenged the cherished Schengen area principles of free movement. This had three major consequences, all contributing to Europe's shift towards autonomy. First, widespread border closures and stricter controls that undermined European integration. Second, the rapid rise and empowerment of extremist anti-EU political parties across the continent. And third, paving the way for exits from the EU, most notably the United Kingdom's departure, Brexit. The internal strains exposed by the refugee crisis were just immense.
Right. And this is precisely where Trump's influence and his alignment with these growing European sentiments becomes very clear and impactful. The U.S. national security strategy, again in 2017, explicitly stated that refugees negatively impact the stability of developed countries. That aligns perfectly with Trump's vocal anti-refugee stance. Our source suggests Trump's position was a direct and deliberate contrast to then-Chancellor Angela Merkel's open border policy, which she was actively trying to apply as a common EU refugee policy across the bloc. His anti-refugee position, coupled with his vocal support for Brexit and his remarkably close ties with emerging far-right leaders across Europe, it significantly contributed to the rapid rise and sort of legitimization of Euroscepticism. This highlights how not just external events, like the refugee crisis, but also deeply embedded domestic dynamics and public desires shape state policies in Europe. That's a core tenet of neoclassical realism, right? Where internal factors mediate external pressures. It was a perfect storm, really, of external and internal forces pushing Europe towards fragmentation.
Indeed. Trump made his support for Brexit unequivocally clear, even during his election campaign back in June 2016, stating, and I quote, "I would personally be more inclined to leave for a lot of reasons, like having a lot less bureaucracy." So even before his election, he was signaling his opposition to European integration. After his election, he consistently called Brexit a wonderful thing, and even claimed he advised then Prime Minister Theresa May to sue the EU. Now, while these comments undeniably made many mainstream European leaders feel vulnerable, uncomfortable, they undeniably encouraged other member states to act more independently, to consider their own exit options, feeding into that Eurosceptic narrative. Our source meticulously details the whole Brexit process itself. Theresa May's unsuccessful attempts to ratify a deal leading to her resignation in July 2019. Boris Johnson subsequently becoming Prime Minister, negotiating a new withdrawal agreement in October 2019, and ultimately the UK's formal exit from the EU in January 2020 after Johnson secured that decisive majority in the December 2019 general elections, which were widely seen as a mandate for Brexit. This shows not only the profound influence of domestic factors, that public desire for exit, but also the significant impact of a powerful international leader's encouragement and validation for such a move. It effectively legitimized a radical political choice. The UK's departure sent shockwaves through the EU, forcing a recalculation of its own future.
And Trump didn't shy away from celebrating this outcome. He saw it as a victory for his America First philosophy, a validation of his strategy. After Johnson's decisive victory, Trump tweeted, "Congratulations to Boris Johnson on his great win. Britain and the United States will now be free to strike a massive new trade deal after Brexit." End quote. He continued, "This deal has the potential to be far bigger and more lucrative than any deal that could be made with the EU. Celebrate Boris." This tweet clearly shows his strategy of encouraging distance from the EU bloc, viewing the UK's departure as an opportunity for the US to forge independent bilateral ties, bypassing the collective. What's fascinating here is that our source suggests this America First approach, characterized by a willingness to act independently and prioritize national interests even over traditional allies. It continued even under President Biden. The AUKUS Pact in 2021, that's security alliance between the US, UK, and Australia, aimed at countering China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific. That was seen by some European commentators as the US sidelining the EU from its future security plans, particularly in this critical region. This suggests that the core shift in US policy towards Europe, which inadvertently fostered European autonomy by signaling a reduced commitment to traditional alliances and a greater focus on bilateral relationships. It appears to have persisted beyond the Trump presidency, albeit with a different diplomatic style and less overt confrontation. Hashtag Trump and the rise of the European far right. Let's connect another crucial dot here, because the Trump era coincided with, and in some ways definitely accelerated, the parallel rise of far-right ideologies and political parties across Europe. We're talking about groups like Lega in Italy, the National Rally, formerly National Front in France, and the AfD, Alternative for Germany, in Germany. Alongside the established, often controversial policies of leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orban and the Polish government, these groups generally shared a distinctly anti-EU stance, often advocating for return to national sovereignty, stricter immigration controls, and championing own country-first policies, echoing Trump's own rhetoric, really, and validating their positions to a wider audience.
Right. And this raises an important question. How did these groups find such common ground and even direct collaboration with the Trump administration? Our source points to clear, direct interactions and ideological kinship. For example, Matteo Salvini, then the leader of Italy's far-right Lega Party. He met with Donald Trump in Philadelphia during Trump's 2016 election campaign, explicitly expressing his support, establishing an early rapport. Salvini later, as Italy's deputy prime minister and minister of interior from June 2018 to September 2019, implemented highly Eurosceptic and anti-immigration policies, directly reflecting that ideological alignment forged with Trump. His populist stance resonated with a segment of the Italian electorate disillusioned with mainstream politics and the EU. In Germany, the AfD immediately congratulated Trump on his election victory, clearly indicating their shared ideological perspective. They saw his victory as a validation of their own nationalist leanings. And following the rise of AfD's influence and increasing ultranationalism in Germany, that open border policy towards refugees that Chancellor Merkel had championed, it visibly shifted to be more protective. Fewer refugees received stricter integration requirements. Our source even mentions Nigel Farage, a key architect of Brexit and former leader of UKIP, meeting Trump in November 2016. Trump subsequently tweeted that many people would like to see it Nigel Farage represent Great Britain as their ambassador to the United States. He would do a great job.
I lost that.
I mean, that's a clear public signal of his preference to deal directly with individual European nations rather than the EU bloc, bypassing traditional diplomatic channels and empowering figures who sought to dismantle existing alliances. This direct public encouragement from a U.S. president was, well, unprecedented.
The shift in relations with Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban is particularly striking, really illustrative of this trend. It shows just how profound this legitimization effect was. Orban had a notably tense relationship with the Obama administration, which viewed his rule in Hungary as increasingly undemocratic and refrained from fostering closer ties. But after Trump's election, Orban publicly stated in a press conference that Trump had invited him to the U.S. to reset the ties, signaling a new era of diplomatic engagement and validation. Orban even went a step further, praising Trump's America First nationalism in the conference in Budapest, saying, and this quote, is really something we have received permission from, if you like, the highest position in the world, so we can now also put ourselves in first place, end quote. That quote, in particular, vividly illustrates how a powerful leader's stance can legitimize and embolden similar nationalistic and authoritarian tendencies elsewhere, effectively granting permission, as Orban put it, to prioritize national interests above collective European integration or liberal democratic norms. It was a clear signal that the old rules of engagement were definitely changing.
This truly highlights the neoclassical realist idea that a state's policies are shaped by not only the international influence of powerful actors, but also its own domestic factors in a complex, dynamic interaction. Orban's statement powerfully underscores how the influence of Trump encouraged a more autonomous policy path among certain EU member states, validating their internal push for national interest and even illiberal policies. A 2020 Pew Research Center report, cited in our source, further reinforces this. It showed that while confidence in the U.S. declined significantly in Western Europe during the Trump era, it remained stable or even increased in Eastern Europe. Hungary showed a remarkably high 66% positive view of the Trump administration, Poland an even higher 79%. This suggests a kind of socially constructed political alliance or ideological kinship among these authoritarian-leaning leaders and their populations, drawn to Trump's nationalistic stance and his explicit disregard for the EU as a collective entity. Furthermore, Trump didn't shy away from intervening in European politics directly. Our source notes his remarks during the 2017 French presidential elections. He openly supported Marine Le Pen, suggesting she was the strongest candidate on issues like borders and radical Islamic terrorism, echoing his own policy priorities. He also publicly praised Poland's populist ruling Law and Justice Party for acting independently against EU directives, even when the EU referred Warsaw to the European Court of Justice over judicial independence issues. Trump framed it as Poland standing up for their independence, their security, and their sovereignty. This is a powerful, direct example of direct encouragement for EU member states to defy the supranational body and pursue their own distinct national interests. It demonstrates the direct influence of a powerful external leader on internal European dynamics and the erosion of collective solidarity.
And when President Biden doesn't engage with these authoritarian leaders in the same open, supportive way that Trump did, Our source suggests his administration continues an America First approach by acting independently on issues that deeply concern European allies. A prime example is the unilateral withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, which left European partners feeling blindsided and undermined, despite their significant contributions to the mission. So the core shift in U.S. policy towards Europe, which fostered European autonomy by signaling a reduced commitment to traditional alliances and a greater focus on bilateral relationships or new bespoke coalitions. It appears to have continued beyond the Trump presidency. Even if the style and rhetoric are markedly different, it's a fundamental reorientation of American foreign policy that has lasting implications for Europe's ongoing quest for autonomy and its place in a more multipolar world. #outro. So what does this all mean when we bring it all together? Our deep dive reveals that the Trump administration's dramatic shift in transatlantic politics, from questioning NATO's essential role and imposing direct economic threats through tariffs, to fostering a perceived collaborating image with Russia and explicitly supporting far-right leaders in Brexit. It profoundly contributed to the emergence of autonomous policies within EU member states. This was largely driven by Trump's view of the EU, not as a traditional ally, but increasingly as a significant trade competitor. That pushed him to engage with individual nations rather than treating the EU as a united entity. The traditional glue that held the transatlantic alliance together really began to dissolve under this pressure.
Yeah, the broader implication here is that this period unequivocally saw a notable rise in far-right political ideologies and parties across Europe, which, influenced and emboldened by Trump's rhetoric and actions, began to openly prioritize their national interests above collective European integration. Our source highlights specific, compelling examples of this shift. The intricate Brexit process itself, driven by that powerful domestic mandate. Italy's active pursuit of individual trade relations with the U.S. to bypass EU tariffs, demonstrating a direct response to external economic pressure. Hungary and Poland's deliberate choice to follow independent, often anti-EU policy paths, validating their internal push for national sovereignty. And the increasing adoption of authoritarian practices in some countries, moving away from liberal democratic norms. These are all clear reflections of states acting on their own perceived national interests. Heavily influenced by significant changes in the international structure, namely the reorientation of traditional Western alliance relations, and by their own unique domestic dynamics. This truly shows how powerful external pressures can ignite and accelerate a profound internal realignment within a complex bloc like the EU, revealing its fault lines under stress.
That's right. And the shift wasn't just a fleeting moment tied solely to one presidency. Our source suggests that even the current U.S. administration, under President Biden, continues to approach the EU as less of a crucial, indispensable economic and political partner in the same way previous administrations did. Instead, there's a visible focus on forging new security alliances, like the AES Pact in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the context of countering China's rising influence. The continuation of that America First policy, a fundamental reprioritization of U.S. interests and strategies, even if the diplomatic style is far more conventional and, less confrontational than under Trump. The implications for European strategic autonomy are enduring.
This raises an important question for you, the listener, to consider. In a world where powerful nations increasingly prioritize their own interests and are willing to act unilaterally or through smaller, bespoke alliances, what are the long-term implications for multinational blocs and established alliances like the European Union? How might such dynamics reshape the very nature of international cooperation, collective security, and global governance in the decades to come? And what new forms of autonomy or alignment might we see emerge as a result, as states continue to navigate this evolving global landscape and, forge their own paths?
A lot to chew on there. We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer, more nuanced understanding of a pivotal moment in U.S.-EU relations and Europe's ongoing complex quest for autonomy. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring.